Welcome, everyone, to the Stoic Salon Podcast, where we talk about life, love, work, play, and a bit of Stoicism. And today I'll be chatting with Professor Christopher Gill and Sukhraj Gill. We're going to be talking about courage. Courage is a big theme for me this year. And not only for me, it is the theme that Brittany Pollatt and I have decided on for our annual women's conference, the Courageous Paths to Flourishing conference, which we founded in 2021. It's a platform to celebrate and amplify women's voices in Stoicism. And this year, I felt that courage was an important conversation to have, to learn a bit more about what the Stoics can teach us about how to be courageous in our lives, both at the domestic and the small sort of local level, but also in a world where everything's just going a bit crazy right now. And I feel that there is a lot of overwhelm. There are so many causes to fight for, to be courageous for. How do you know? How do you know what to choose? How do you even know how to be courageous? When to show up, when not to? It seems to me that a conversation is needed. So here we are on Stoic Salon Podcast. I'll be talking to speakers who will be presenting at the conference at Courageous Paths to Flourishing, which is now scheduled to occur on Saturday, the 1st of October. There are tickets available at Eventbrite, and I'll put a link somewhere around this YouTube video or this podcast, wherever you happen to be listening and or watching. If you tune into this podcast before October the 1st, then head on over and check out the conference. Join us. There will be an opportunity to chat with speakers. We have a coaching courage panel scheduled with a workshop, basically how to coach yourself to be courageous in any sphere of your life where you feel you need to be. So yeah. Anyway, I get to speak to Chris Gill. And of course, you all already know Chris Gill. Chris Gill is a scholar of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, emeritus professor of ancient thought at the University of Exeter. He has researched and published especially on the interface between ethics and psychology in Greek and Roman thought. His books in the area include Personality in Greek Epic, Tragedy and Philosophy, The Self in Dialogue, and The Structured Self in Hellenistic and Roman thought. He has also written extensively on Plato, especially his use of dialogue and narrative form for philosophical purposes. For instance, Plato's Atlantis story, text, translation, and commentary. Now, much of Chris Gill's recent work has indeed been centered on Stoic philosophy, including Marcus Aurelius, Meditations Book 1-6, translated with an introduction and commentary that came out in 2013, and the introduction and notes to the Oxford World's Classics translations by Robin Hard, a much-loved translation for many of us. Since 2012, he has been closely involved with Modern Stoicism. It's a collaborative project and organization designed to make Stoic principles accessible as life guidance to a broad public audience. And in that connection, he has given many talks at Stoicon conferences, including one in Athens in 2019. And Sukhraj Gill is a solicitor based in London, also involved and very interested in Stoic study and practice. Sukhraj is part of the Aurelius Foundation, which is a foundation founded by Justin Stead, and its mission is to support young people to live a life of clarity and purpose and offer all the additional support required in the face of increasing challenges in the modern world. So look out for Aurelius Foundation over at aureliusfoundation.com. And on that note, I think it's time for us to begin this podcast proper. I'm going to invite Chris and Sukhraj into this little Zoom room and we can get started. I really hope you enjoy this podcast. If you have any questions, just let me know in a comment below or around this podcast, or just email me at hello@KathrynKoromilas.com. And of course, if you're listening or watching, do please click the subscribe button, click the follow button, just support this in any way you can. I think that the way that algorithms work is that the more clicks and interactions that you give this podcast, follows and likes and reviews, the better it will perform. And therefore, I guess these conversations will be just more available to everyone who might want them and need them. So I would love your support. Thank you so much in advance. And on that note, let us get started. Well, hello again, Chris and Sukhraj, and welcome again to the Stoic Salon Podcast. We're chatting about courage, and I'm so excited to be in this conversation with you both. I wanted just to start with asking you both, maybe to start with some personal ideas or conceptions of courage. I know that you're both very much informed by Stoicism, but I wonder if you can think to the days before Stoicism, or maybe even sort of beyond Stoicism, maybe to the current popular mainstream conceptions of courage. What do you think that courage means today? And do you have any ideas or images or signaling or memories of what images of courage and conceptions of courage you grew up with? And if we start there, then maybe we have something to use to compare what, say, Stoic notions of courage, how Stoic notions of courage differ or add to the conversation. So I might start with you, Chris. Just conceptions of courage beyond or before Stoicism. Do you have any comments?
Oh, fascinating. I grew up, my father was in the RAF, so I grew up in a military background. So courage then would be the first thing you would think of in my family. Then would be the courage that someone shows in battle, in fighting. Not that it was much discussed, but it was there. But I think my parents, who were quite thoughtful in a way, thoughtful Methodists, would have wanted to place that kind of courage in a broader context, in terms of living properly, living, doing your duty, living well. So I think that was probably what I grew up with. And of course, then as your life unfolds, many other influences come in. But perhaps that would do as just a starting point, because I think for many that will be the military context, fighting in battle. That will be. I'll just mention one thing. In Singapore, when we were in Singapore, and we came on and we were driving along, and suddenly we saw a man catching flame. He somehow caught himself up in flames, and my father stopped the car. There was no one else around. He stopped the car. He took a blanket from the bag, and he wrapped this man round in blanket, and this suppressed the flames and actually put it out. Of course, it hurt his hands, but he just did it, right away. And it was a very interesting, very brief example of courage. Make much of it, but it was a very striking moment.
Sorry, Chris, was that your father that did that?
My father, yes. This was when I was a child. This was when I was about 10 or 11. And we happened to live in Singapore at that moment. Mm.
And did you witness that?
Well, I was in the back seat. He was in the front seat. So he just pulled. It was in a long sort of, for some reason, there was no other cars around. Nobody else around. Nobody else would have stopped, could have seen it. So there he was, he'd caught fire. His clothes was all caught fire on the side of the road. And he just immediately stopped without skidding. Very, kept a blanket in the boot of the car trunk and wrapped him. Yeah, no, it was striking. Yeah. So anyway, just something I happen to think of, just because you're raising the question of courage.
That is such
an example of courage. It's a very good example of courage, because he didn't think, but he did what was necessary. He saw that there was a need to do something. He didn't want to burn his hands, but he could see there was a need. There was something to realize by courage. And I think that's a very important part of courage. The Stoics stress this too. Courage is about what is worth enduring pain for. So anyway, just a couple of starting points.
I think we'll come back to that, because it's such an interesting example of thinking quickly.
Yeah.
And getting it right as well. Sometimes we think quickly and respond and maybe get it wrong. So yeah, I think we'll come back to that, because that's an excellent example. Thank you for that. Sukhraj, how about you? Any memories from maybe childhood, what courage looked and felt like. So before Stoicism, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think before we leap into that, Chris, I love how you told that story so casually. Your father, in fact, sounds like a superhero. And I think definitely we'll come back to that story because it's such a great example of how we can exhibit values just by being who we are. These, when we have these values clarification exercise and we just live our lives, we don't stop to think because we're exercising virtues like courage all the time. So your father didn't even think. But I think mentioning superheroes, I have to say, Kathryn, growing up, I always saw courage as something being quite loud, a lot of bravado, being a superhero, being the one in front. And certainly in today's age with social media, there is, I think, sometimes a perception that the person who is loudest, who has the most opinions or is the most vocal, in fact, is displaying the most courage. And it's interesting because we even know as children, we find a lot of personal battles, even though they can seem very small, whether that's feeling like we're one step behind our siblings, or if there's a lot of bullying in the playground. A lot of that requires quiet courage. But my perception growing up is that courage is loud, that it's the person who always has their best foot forward and is leading the pack. But certainly post-Stoicism, we all know that simply just isn't the case.
Mm. Okay, you've brought us to post-Stoicism. I agree that notions of courage or images of courage were the loud ones. I always thought that courage was, just urgent and bold and risky even. And also that idea that those who are courageous get rewarded from some sort of external body, those who judge courage. So especially in the military, Chris, you'd get awards for courage, medals, etc. So is courage, what does it look like from the outside for a Stoic? Do the Stoics have a sense that the courageous person is courageous by virtue of reputation? Is there some sort of award ceremony? Is it seen from the outside? Is there a conception of what it should look like? Or, Sukhraj, you mentioned this quiet courage. What happens to those instances of quiet courage? Do we need recognition to know that we've been courageous? Does anyone have a comment on that, Chris?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the Stoics would stress very much what you're calling the quiet, the inner dimension of courage. The external impression of it is quite secondary. They didn't ignore it completely, but it's secondary. Yeah, I mean, for them, courage. Well, I think there are two. Courage is a kind of knowledge. Courage is a kind of knowledge and understanding. It's knowing how to behave in a given context. And indeed, they stress that courage, you can't in a way talk about courage on its own. I mean, that's the thing about courage. Courage is part of virtue or wisdom as a whole. And you can't, it's what they call the unity of the virtues, unless you've got all four virtues, wisdom, courage, justice, and moderation, and are exercising them at the same time. You can't have courage. And if you have courage, this is a property of your knowledge, your understanding, your character, your life. It's something embedded. It's part of it. And that's the important dimension. They do. I mean, there is a work of Cicero called On Duties, which is very interesting, actually, for this topic. And he does talk about glory and fame, but he makes it very clear that from a Stoic perspective, that's all secondary. Glory is a response to virtue. We do respond to virtues, the virtues of courage, but that's secondary. And so you can have the virtue, have it exercised without anybody knowing. It could be entirely invisible, and it would still be courageous. It would still be operative.
Sukhraj, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with courage, there is always a danger when we're relying on external reward. I think for positive reinforcement for anything, It then comes down to recognition from others that they're observing closely to see that something needs reward. And then also, I think that you can sometimes fall danger to then only pursuing those acts of courage, which may be visible. But I think when it comes to courage, and certainly from my Stoic interpretation and my understanding, is that there is courage through action, but there can also be courage through restraint as well. And courage through restraint isn't generally visible. Often we don't know what's happening in someone's personal life, what's going on behind the scenes. And that can look very different from the workplace, as being a child, being a young adult. From Chris's experience, working with a lot of young people in higher education. So it does need to come from within. And it calls to mind a quote from Meditations, which is, I think, an emerald is an emerald, even if it isn't praised. I think when I think of courage, when I think of many of the virtues, I find myself in difficult situations, and we're thinking about restraint or those virtues which are exercised, which are less visible, we have to remember that it needs to come from within, that we're not always going to get praise or reward. And these things, if they come, then they may be welcome, but they're certainly not what we're relying on as we move through life. And I think that is one of the biggest things to take away. And especially when we find ourselves in upper hand situations as we go through life, or as we climb our career ladder, often courage is acting through restraint. Or when it comes to situations where you're holding all of the cards and you have to think, I can walk away with everything here, but equally what is fair, what is right, and holding ourselves to that Stoic definition of courage, which is doing what is right, rather than a situation where you're thinking, I can probably take a lot of advantage here as well. So I keep that quote from Meditations very close to me at all times.
I love that, Sukhraj. Can you come up, or either of you, do you have an example of restraint as courage? Does anything come to mind, either personal example or something in the news recently?
I think I can come up with a fairly simplistic one that I'm sure that everyone would empathize with who's listening. And that's simply with family. We all get into squabbles and arguments with our family, whether it's parents, siblings, our children. And when it comes to personal relationships, we all know those red hot buttons. We all know what people's trigger points are. And I think for everyone who has those close relationships, that you know exactly which switches to press on. And sometimes in those situations, courage, quiet courage, that restrained courage which we're exercising there, is knowing what not to say. Maybe courage plus wisdom in stepping away to preserve that relationship, to not damage the other person or cause hurt where hurt just isn't helpful. That is, I think, something that everyone here, and I can see poor Chris nodding at me as well, is that we've all been there. And I think that is a great example of where we've come across courage in our everyday lives.
That's really interesting, Sukhraj, because years ago, I used to think that stepping away from an argument or from a distressing situation or any sort of domestic squabble or anything at all really was a sign of weakness. I always felt that stepping away was weakness, but fronting up and responding was courageous, the right thing to do, even if it meant getting into an argument. So I don't know where I inherited that idea from, but it is quite interesting reading more about the Stoics now, that stepping away and restraint is an act of courage. So yeah, thank you for bringing. That's a great example as well. Thank you, Chris. Did you have a comment or an example of restraint?
No, I'm not sure I've got an example. In Seneca has a very interesting dialogue on peace of mind, and one of the things he says there is that one way of expressing virtue, and the virtue could be courage, is by silence. There are certain moments when not to speak, is to take a stand. And actually, Epictetus has examples of this. That there are cases where not saying something when people expect you to say it, they expect confirmation, they expect you to agree with them, and then you don't. And silence can take courage. So not only restraint, but actually keeping silent can be a form of courage, as well as a form of wisdom and justice. Yeah, and I think it's very interesting, the restraint idea. Yeah.
Mm. And I think it's really hard because is it just me, or are we not told, speak up for yourself, disagree, do all that stuff, be loud and be argumentative, because that is brave, that is courage. Silence doesn't really have that. I don't know, it doesn't seem to be something that we're taught.
No, it's something that you learn.
It's
not something you can be taught.
Yeah.
When not to speak.
Yeah.
Knowing when to hold your tongue, that's something you learn. No, you can't learn it. You can't learn it by rote, but you can see it by examples. I mean, again, speaking to my parents, there are many times when I've noticed my mother not saying something. And that took, in fact, that was it took wisdom, but also courage. Yeah. Just in general, just thinking about the Stoic approach to courage in general. I mean, and just going back to this contrast with the military, I began with the military. But of course, the Stoics, one of the very clear features of the Stoic approach is its universalizing approach. So courage isn't just, in the ancient world and the modern world, it tends to be associated with the military context, with fighting, and with this sort of declaratory, assertive style that you both referred to. And of course, what the Stoics want to say is no, it's something that's much more universal than that. And actually, this approach goes back to Socrates. And there's a wonderful dialogue, one of Plato's dialogues, called the Laches. Laches was a general. And Socrates has a discussion between Laches and Nicias, and he says, well, hang on, what's courage? It's a typical Socratic one. Oh, what's this courage business? And they, of course, they think, oh, well, it's standing in the battle line and, doing well in battle. And gradually he leads them to see that it's not that underneath that is knowledge of good and bad. That understand that courage, and indeed all you would say that all the virtues, is knowledge of good and bad in any context. So courage is not context dependent. So you can show courage in all the many different aspects of life, and not just the military. And that insight, the idea of the universality, is clearly fundamental for them. It's anticipated, interestingly, although this might not be. For example, there's a Euripides Medea. There's an extraordinary, a great tragedy, and she says, notably at one point in this play, I would rather stand in the battle line 3 times than have a baby than give birth. So it's a very okay. Well, that's only one form of courage, of course, but that's a very interesting example. And the Stoics, although they don't cite that, it's an example they could recognize. They could see the force of that. That courage isn't, it can be all the different contexts of life, including giving birth, which I must say does take. I can see from the outside. I had 4 sons. I can see it takes courage to give birth. So that's another very interesting. It's not just taking life, or, well, not that the military thing is really taking life, but being ready to take life. It's also giving life, giving birth to life that can take courage.
Wow, there's so much coming up here. I don't know where to pull from. But just because you mentioned giving birth, and since we are, having this conversation because of the Women's Conference coming up in October, shall we do a bit of a sidestep into maybe a gender discussion? Gender and courage, women. Sukhraj, do you have any comments on growing up as a young girl and courage, or just any comments about courage, for women? And if it differs, or just
I think that's something that I did want to pick up on there, is that courage can look really different from, yes, the genders, but also depending on what stage of life you're at. If we're talking about giving birth, I don't have children, but I have close friends who do. I've got young children in the family. And you see with young mothers how they learn as they go along, right? Courage looks different, to Chris's point around you're learning by example and not by rote. And negotiating with a toddler is incredibly difficult. And I think sometimes mothers do learn by example. Actually, it may be better to negotiate this at a later time or date or post nap. And courage can just look really different depending on what stage of life you're at. And I certainly think when I look back to my younger years as a young teen growing up in the world, courage can look really different. When typically you're growing up as a young girl, you come across different challenges at school, at university. We're always seeing on the news, it's always very topical, the crimes committed against women, or when we see, I think there's a story in the news at the minute, and that the kind of violence against women we see. And I think growing up and even now, the kinds of challenges you're considering often look different to men. And I don't want to get too political, but we do often think about challenges differently, where we've seen a lot of the vigils held around London, women considering, should I go out at night? Is it too late to go for a walk? Would it be more sensible to stay at home? And these are often things that men are not always considering. I'm not saying that's universal, but I can say from an observational standpoint, the challenges women are often looking at are different from men. That's not to say that the challenges for men are less so. I would say challenges from a gender perspective, from a male perspective, and I'm sure Chris will speak to, can look different for women. We often see, or we hear about, men who are often viewed as predators, and they're not. I have close friends who will strike up a conversation with a woman in a bar and often feel like they're put on the back foot because they're almost proving themselves to be safe, to just be a normal, nice guy. And courage can look different in that situation for them as well. So I think when we're looking at courage from two sides of the same coin, it can just look different. And that's where, to Chris's point, sometimes we're learning by reflection, and sometimes we're learning from a contextual perspective. We learn from it and we say, next time, maybe this would be the better way of handling it. Maybe next time, the best way to handle this is not to get angry and instead to show patience and reflection.
Yes, I was just thinking about Musonius Rufus. I've got a little quote from him, and he brings in, he talks about whether you're male or female. If you're educated correctly, he says in Lectures 4.7. So he talks about education as becoming accustomed to enduring and not fearing, and by becoming educated and practicing these things, a person would become courageous. So how do we learn to be courageous? Male, female person. Any comments on that, Chris?
Well, it's difficult to separate it out, isn't it? Because of the idea of the unity of the virtues. So learning to be courageous, I mean, a key part of it is learning how to live, how to live a good human life. So what is a good human life? So it's all these: learning how to be wise, learning how to be just. You can't be courageous unless you're doing what's just to people. Some people think they're being courageous just because they face danger or they face, negative reactions. But it's only worth doing that if what you're doing is worthwhile, if the objective is good. So I think this is something the Stoics say. So if this question of the objective, whether what you're trying to do is realize the virtuous course of action or what they call the preferred indifference. So the objective is critical. So it's learning. So it's difficult, I think, to separate out what courage involves. But they associate it very much with endurance. So courage is going to come up in those situations where there is something that would have normally elicit fear or anxiety or pain. That's the domain of courage. But you'll only be able to deal with those situations if you bring to bear other kinds of understanding. So it's a multi-level process. You can't just learn to be courageous on it. You say, "Oh, I only want to be courageous. I don't have other virtues."
Teach me. Teach me that.
I don't care about wisdom. I don't care about moderation. I want to live a life of, I want to. And there are people like this. Of course, there are people like that who actually think that way. And we're talking about gender. There are quite a lot of men who think like that. They want to have everything and do everything and eat everything and drink everything and, and have all the women they want. Oh, they also want to be courageous. Well, you can't be because your life will be just shaped by all those other kinds of forms of error, the Stoics would see. So I think it's difficult to separate out courageous from, but there is, of course, one domain of learning is what the Stoics thought about this preparation for evil, preparation for disaster. And that's something you've actually talked about a lot, haven't you, Kathryn, in terms of death? So in a way, it's difficult to talk about courage without talking about death, because death is the supreme area where courage is required of us. The situations of danger in battle and everywhere else are linked with death. So facing death, facing your own death, and perhaps even more difficult, facing that of others, is perhaps the supreme area of courage. And so I think the Stoics are right, along with other thinkers, to think that that's one of the areas you have to train yourself for, in a way.
I think that's what Musonius Rufus, in that quote that I sort of started reading from, he talks about learning how to not fear death. And that leads to becoming courageous. But then there's Diogenes Laertius, who says, just to stick with the learning theme a bit longer, he who has virtue has a theoretical knowledge. This is a translation. I don't know what it would have been like. Has a theoretical knowledge of what is to be done and also practices it. So, Sukhraj, you mentioned how the mothers are learning as they practice. But then your father, the example of your father, it was just this instantaneous thing.
Yeah.
So, is that the goal, that you just keep practicing and learning? It becomes almost just a default way of knowing what an instant.
I think they're all interconnected. Practice can teach you. Seeing examples of courageous action would help you. Reflecting also helps. So there's no magic bullet. In other words, it's putting all these things, putting things together, putting together theory, putting together practice, putting together examples, living. It's got to be you that's living. It can't be just all in your head. It won't work. I'll just give a couple of other examples about courage and facing death. Both my mother and my wife, my late wife, found themselves in the position of having terminal cancer. And so both of them had to face death. And of course, I also had to face their death. And these were situations of great difficulty. And they required courage of them, and they required courage of me and everyone else involved. And interestingly, one very interesting thing is I think both of them showed great courage, but in quite different ways. My mother, of course, she was older. She prepared herself, as it were, for death. She quietly reflected on it, and she was just preparing herself. And that was impressive in its own way. It didn't leave a great deal of room for me to help her, I didn't feel. But anyway, she did that. My wife, on the other hand, was completely different. She wanted to live life to the full for every moment that she was alive. She wanted, you'd say, oh, should we go for a walk? Yes. Should we go out and do that? Yes. Should we go to the cinema? Yes. So it's completely different. She wanted to live every moment that she was alive. And both of these, I think, she encourage are two different styles. So these are personal styles. I think the gendered styles, particularly, are just personal styles. And yet, in both cases, they accepted the fact of death. And I, of course, then had in both cases to respect both the fact of death and also their way of preparing for it. So, yes. So I think there's a lot. So, well, there's a lot there, isn't there? There's the preparation for death. There's also bringing to bear different qualities. Both of them, I think, brought to bear different qualities. And there's also, of course, it required courage of me. I had to show courage to respond properly to those events. So I hope perhaps there's some examples, some implications there for the.
Thank you for sharing that, Chris. They're beautiful examples. Really lovely. Sukhraj, did you want to add anything to where we are in the conversation at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I want you to pick up on Chris's idea of unity, and also I think death, and not in a gloomy fashion. I think, Chris, I've had some similar experiences in my personal life as well. And I think when we separate out the virtues, so we're only going to live with wisdom, or we're only going to live with courage, I do think that we sometimes can fall a little foul of the principles because we're not adopting this multi-layered approach. And I think one of the quotes that you shared with me, Kathryn, was actually from Seneca. I won't quote the whole thing, but courage, rather, it is knowledge of how to distinguish between what is bad and what is not. And another very short quote from Meditations that I keep close to me is stand straight and not held straight. And often when I'm walking through life and I come through various challenges and I decide how am I going to react to it, I think we can consider what does good look like? To Seneca's point, what does our evaluation of good look like? What does that outcome look like? And therefore, which virtues do we need to draw on to handle that situation? And I think adopting a process of evaluation allows us to consider what form that virtue takes. Almost that when to speak, when not to speak. And when we consider death as a topic, we can often have a very visceral reaction to it. We've either come up against this as a challenge, have we come across it, have we considered it, or we haven't. And it's one that I consider quite often. On a very, very personal level, I was very lucky to survive the pandemic when I contracted COVID at the beginning of the pandemic, and it took me months to recover. Even when I returned to work, I had a graduated return and it was very slow. And more recently, my mother as well, Chris, has been diagnosed with cancer, and hopefully she will go on to make a full recovery. But I look at my own reaction to death and contemplation of death. Through the experience with COVID, I was on my knees within a week of severe symptoms. I hadn't come across Stoicism. And it's actually our founder, Justin Stead, who introduced me to Stoicism. And really, it's from that contemplation of death, of not handling the situation very gracefully. I was very angry, very frustrated, as suddenly life had been derailed. The promotion I was aiming for was now definitely going to be out of reach because I was signed off sick indefinitely for that period. And I didn't, like I say, I didn't handle the situation gracefully. But coming out of that, Stoicism teaches you how to die, how to understand death in order to understand how to live. And understanding how we stand straight without being held straight. How we understand that we are the emerald that doesn't need to be praised, that this drives from within. And Seneca's point, to understand the difference between what is good and what is bad, we then ultimately choose how we're going to walk through life and how we want to live. And I see now, a couple of years later, finding out about my mother's diagnosis, from a very practical perspective, handling the situation very differently. The suddenness of the situation, managing the ambiguity of it. We're dealing with a lot of NHS shortages in the UK, counselled appointments, waiting for appointments, trying to get hold of the consultant to have conversations, the emotional management at home, to our earlier points, knowing when not to speak, when just to listen. And that also requires a lot of different kinds of courage. So I think it's incredibly topical to bring these areas up of life, because we will always come up against these kinds of challenges. We're always going to need to face these things head on. But when Stoicism teaches us about how our time is finite and we consider our death, we can really then start to think about how to live. And in the context of today's podcast, today's discussion, when we're considering courage and we take that step back and we think about not just how do I want to exercise courage, but how do I want to live? What does the quality of the individual really look like with the finite time I think I have? Maybe it's a little bit less, maybe it's a little bit more. We can then exercise the virtues in a much more mindful way and call on them for what the situation really desires, what it requires. Sometimes we do need to speak up, and being the quiet in person in the room isn't the most helpful thing to do. Sometimes we do need to stand up, not be held straight, and voice our opinions. But by all means, it's not what every situation calls for. And I think the quiet versions of courage that aren't always recognized are often the ones that we need to reflect on the most.
Speechless. Well, that was really profound and impressive, Sukhraj, what you just shared. And it's quite interesting how you've shown us how through your initial introduction and study of Stoicism has kind of built you up in a way. You've built strength through that, and it's impacted on how you're dealing with other difficulties down the line. I was just thinking, just reminded me of another quote that I've come here with from Seneca. Again, it's in the handout that we're preparing for everyone for the conference. It's Seneca saying, what is courage? It is the impregnable fortification for human weakness. By encircling himself with it, a person can calmly endure throughout his life's siege because he uses his own strength and his own weapons. So I just imagined you there, just this encircling yourself with this courage. That's a really interesting image. And then there's one other thing that I wanted to bring up. So I kept reading all these quotations from the Stoics, and death kept coming up, and I couldn't quite get why death was so important, even though, as you mentioned, Chris, I'm really interested in death contemplation, etc. But Sukhraj, you really, and Chris, your example really shows that if we can conquer, or at least understand, the ultimate fear, then we can deal with all fear that prevents us from being courageous. And we go back to your quote, Chris, your definition of courage from what is Stoic virtue in Stoicism Today, Selected Writings 2. You said that courage involves knowing how to act and feel correctly in situations of danger, in facing things seen as fearful. So I want to talk about fear and how that impacts the way we live, maybe thoughts that stops us from maybe being courageous in certain situations. Mm-hmm. Do we have any comments on fear? What is it? On the one hand, I think at one point, Seneca again says that you won't go out of your way to put yourself in harm's way. So you'll avoid risk and danger if you can, but not because you fear danger. So on the one hand, is there a suggestion that ultimately we won't fear things, or do we feel the fear and do it anyway? What's going on with fear?
No, ultimately we won't fear. That's the Stoic. No, that's the Stoic view. The Aristotelian view is that the danger is that courage is shown in situations where you go in and see the danger but you, as it were, make yourself face the danger. For the Stoics, the ideal is one in which the fear drops away. Now, the fear drops away. So fear is a passion. It's an irrational passion. It's something we want to eventually eliminate, or to work towards elimination. Now, how can that be? Well, it's because fear depends on the judgment of what is bad. Sukhraj mentioned this, what is good and what is bad. This is the fundamental question. So you come to the point where you say, well, the worst thing in the world isn't dying, or the worst thing in the world isn't, some kind of injury or illness or whatever. The worst thing in the world is behaving badly. It is your own character and understanding becoming defective, becoming unworthy of a human being. So the worst thing in the world is for our lives to lose their moral quality. That's what's terrible. So the worst thing is not dying. The worst thing is becoming a master criminal. It is becoming a malicious and destructive human being. That's the worst thing in the world. And that's what we should avoid. And so the Stoics have this idea. So there's fear, which is fear of death and things of that kind. And there's what they call caution. Now, caution isn't a kind of weak, watered-down version of fear. It's not fearing only a little bit, but not too much. Caution is being concerned about doing the wrong thing. Caution is being concerned about going wrong, about becoming a bad person. So the Stoics believe that as your judgment and understanding improve, so the quality of your emotional life is changed. That's and part of that is that you lose fear, envy, and other emotions, that they anger. All those emotions depend on bad judgments. So fear goes in the end. In the end, you don't have fear.
So your father, in that instance,
yes, he
would have been no.
Right. What my father focused on what needed to be done.
Yeah.
Here is a situation. Here is a man burning. I can put it out. I know how to put it out. So there was, practical knowledge was part of it. So he had a blanket in his car. He was prepared. He knew what to do. He wrapped him up. And that was that. So, of course, he knew his hands would become burnt. But that didn't matter in relation to saving this man's life, of course, which is what he did. And so, yeah, so that's why judgment is all part of it. It's all built into it. Mm. Yeah. So the fear drops away.
Chris, I'm just thinking, if there were another person in your father's situation there with the burning man on the side of the road.
Yeah.
So your father obviously had practical knowledge, almost evidence that he knew how to do it. He had a blanket, etc. Therefore, all of that contributed. Plus his own, character, and must have, become wise over the years. And, what if there was someone there that didn't have all that kind of evidence that they could pull it off? I don't know where I'm going with this question.
Yeah.
But sometimes we're often in situations where we don't. Yeah.
Yeah, there are lots of situations like that, aren't there? I don't know, really. Yeah, he'd come through the Second World War. He drew on lots of experiences.
Yeah.
So he knew what, I don't know what I would have done in that situation. I would have been much less well equipped to deal with it. I might not have known what to do. I might not have known how to, I might have sought help, but by the time help came, it might be too late. Yeah, no.
So can we all do what your father did in that situation?
Well,
and if we can't,
no,
what
probably
does that mean morally?
No, probably not. But we can all show courage. We can all show courage. We can all find ourselves in situations of courage. And we can all, there's some situations where some people will respond better and more effectively than others. But I think it is also true that nobody is this, and the Stoics believe this very much. We all have the seeds of virtue within us. We can all develop, and we can all learn gradually and work towards learning. how to respond well. And that's why I mentioned the examples of my mother and my wife, because they had learned, they were bringing to bear on facing their own death what they had learned through life, not because they were exceptional people. Well, I'd say we're all exceptional. I mean, they brought to bear the things that they could to face, to have the courage.
Mm.
So I think we all, yes, some people are going to be better at some things than others, but we all have those capacities. It's not that some people are going to be courageous and others not, and certainly not that men are going to be courageous, women not, or women courageous men. No, it's a universality, I think.
Sukhraj, do you have any comments on fear? And if you want to bring in a gendered comment again?
Yeah, I think one of the points I wanted to make on a really practical level is often where we have fear from, taken from an evolutionary level, there'll be things that we are fearful from for our own physical well-being. There's also fears that we perhaps have as children, fears that we developed as we grow up. And I think what's interesting about fear is it can really influence your judgment and perception of a situation about whether or not it is actually dangerous. You can take conference room example. Often I see sometimes the paralegals on my team at my firm are a little reluctant to ask questions in a more public setting, or where there are more people as part of that forum. Now, nothing's going to happen to them if they ask a question. Absolutely nothing's going to happen. Either they'll get the answer or they won't. There is no consequence. But sometimes I do see them a little bit sweaty palmed, scared of putting their hand up, their head above the parapet and asking the question. And in situations like that, it really is about their perception of the situation rather than any real danger that's going to occur there. So I think to overcome that, to Chris's point, is his father did what needed to be done in that situation. He interpreted this is the best outcome for this situation. So to your average person, your common man on the street who perhaps doesn't have that intimate knowledge of how to put someone out, what do I do? What tools do I need? It's really then considering in that space, not what necessarily their perception is of the danger, of the fear. It's really what is the best possible outcome here that I can contribute to. And I've got a really personal example here. A few weeks ago, I was walking down the street to the tube station. I was just heading to work, running a little bit late. I was in a rush. And as I was, walking down, I was probably a few minutes from the tube station, I heard a woman screaming. It was about 7:45 in the morning. The street was empty. I'm looking around, taking my headphones out. I can hear a woman screaming, wailing. It sounded like a lot of pain, and I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. I didn't know how to intervene. What would I even do if I intervened? I didn't know what the issue was. And in that situation, you ask yourself, what does courage look like? Had I seen a physical kerfuffle happening on the street, would I feel as able to break that up? I don't know. If I was a better, well-built man, would I feel more comfortable in intervening physically? Perhaps I would. It's difficult to say. And in that situation, to Chris's point, had there been a different man in the car that wasn't your father, how would they know how to react to that situation? As it was, I decided to call the police, and I thought the best thing I can do is report it, because having spent a couple of minutes on the street thinking, okay, I can't see where this is coming from. I can't see anyone physically. There's nothing further I can do. But possibly the worst thing I can do is carry on about my day and not do anything. So I thought, right, I'm going to call the police. I'm going to report this. And after that, it's out of my hands. But I've done the best I can do in that situation. Now, had I been a police officer, maybe my training would have led me to do something totally different. To say, actually, what I'm going to do is maybe I'm going to knock on a few doors and say, can you hear this? How long has this been going on to? And put my investigator's hat on. But in the situation, to your point about fear and your perception, when your father was in the car, Chris, I think it's a consideration of what is the best outcome here and how can I contribute to that? If I can't fix a situation entirely, what is my 2 cents worth to a better outcome here?
Yeah. That's such a great example, Sukhraj. We have to kind of, in a sense, know who we are and what is within our means, what we're capable of, and doing the best that we can. There seems to be a lot of overwhelm, I think, trying to find out or work out what it is that we're supposed to do. And actually, this leads on to my final question. Speaking of overwhelm, there's so much going on in the world where we're called on to help, to be courageous on the street if need be, but also larger issues, global issues, climate change. And I know, Chris, you're quite interested in how Stoicism and how Stoic ethics might inform us and how to repair our relationship with the environment, etc. There are environmental causes, other causes, political, social causes, gender causes, political causes. And social media brings all those causes to us on our phone, and there's just message after message telling us how bad the world is in. And I feel that maybe some of us don't really know which cause to help, which to commit to, how much to commit to. Do we drop everything and run off and, save the planet? Is there a way that Stoicism might help us make sense of the world and our place in it, and how to make a choice as to how to help and how to be courageous in any given area?
There's a really, in Cicero's on Duties, book 1, there's a really interesting discussion of the 4 roles, that we have 4 roles in life. And what we should do is try to bring these together, achieve consistency between these. So one role is the common human role, a role of somebody who can potentially exercise the virtues, the 4 virtues. So then that's common to everyone. That's being a good human being. So being a good human being, and potentially exercising the virtues. There is your individual role. Your role as an individual. We all have certain qualities, we have certain abilities, and not others. Certain styles, certain, those are different things. Then we also have a specific social situation. We have a certain social role, certain context. We might not remember it through our lives, but we have a context, and we have certain projects which we are undertaking, which we certainly a career or a set of objectives. And the theory of the 4 roles is about consistency. What we're aiming to work towards is consistency. So it's bringing those 4 together: the general universal one, the particular, the individual one, the context, and the foreign. So I think that would be a test. Can I specifically make a contribution that's distinctive to these? Which of these various causes can I contribute to, given who I am, where I'm coming from, and what I am trying to achieve in any case? So I think the 4% area is a really useful, actually, practical guide in this way. Not on its own, of course, you have to take it with lots of other things, but I do think it is helpful. Mm. And so, and what it stresses, of course, is you can't do everything, because you're not in every situation. Take the 3rd role, you're not simultaneously, a Filipino, I don't know what it might be, millionaire or something, it's not. So you've got to think of each of the roles and bring them and bring them together. Mm.
Mm. Do you have an example of to illustrate that, like just one example of someone and how they might navigate that? Does an example come to mind?
Well, actually, I do have. I might just cite Cicero's example, which is kind of courage again, and it does show courage. And he cites 2 examples of how you respond to tyranny. So 2 different responses to tyranny. Plato, who can't bring himself to put up with the tyranny of Julius Caesar, and rather than live in dishonor, he kills himself. He commits suicide, which the Stoics didn't think was wrong. I mean, it was something in certain situations, suicide would be the answer. So ultimately courageous in that way. The other response is to accept that indeed Julius Caesar is going to take over, and it might be any tyrant, of course, and to make things as tolerable as, make the best of it. So that's an example. That might seem a rather extreme example, but we do often find ourselves in situations where power is being exercised in a way that we find unacceptable. I mean, we often find ourselves in that situation, don't we? There's a government that you think is going in the wrong direction, and you have to decide what to do about it. And then,
Chris, why was suicide the right option for Cato? Which role did that
Cato
align with?
was the emblem of the Republic, as it were. He was, his whole life, Cicero says, his whole life had been dedicated to defending the Republic, the Roman Republic, with its specific constitutional forms, its modes of exercising the virtues. And he knew that under Caesar, that would no longer be possible. So his life, as it were, had come to an end. His life as he was intensely political person. Yeah.
And so for which person then would sort of restraint and being the better option? Yeah.
Well, there's restraint of different kinds in both cases, but the second example would show more restraint. In a way, yes.
Okay.
But I think these are not easy, and that's not an easy example. No.
Yeah. So definitely something to think about. Sukhraj, do you have an example or response to overwhelm in the world?
I think what Chris has presented there is a really practical way of evaluating about what you're going to support and how you're going to support. I think the element I'd add to that, and the challenge that I often come across and sometimes become a little distressed by, is that there are many, many worthy causes in the world. But with the age of news that we live in, often we are presented with other people's opinions of what we should think and how we should act in response to a cause. And I think in today's world, a large portion of our thinking when it comes to deciding which cause and how to support, is really filtering through what our own educated opinion is, not accepting other people's opinions as the only view and the only valid view, and then not considering what that really means for us. Do we actually agree? I think often that today we do sometimes fall into a little bit of a danger, a little bit of a pit in accepting other people's views as gospel or as the ultimate conclusion on any version of events. And we have seen when it's come to protection of freedom of speech, when it's become to political movements, we've seen it in the US, we've seen it more recently in Sri Lanka as well, where sometimes in acting for a cause, sometimes we interpret courage in a way that can sometimes be quite destructive as well. Now, it's not for me to say what is right or what is wrong, but I think for the purposes of talking about courage and considering courage, when we're taking Chris's walkthrough of the model of our roles and our consideration, when we're applying it to the modern day era, there really does need to be a really tough layer on how we're evaluating a situation before we're deciding how to engage based on on our own assessment, its merits, and our assessment of other people's conclusions.
Thanks, Sukhraj. And thanks, Chris. I think we covered quite a lot of ground in that hour. Thank you so much for joining me. I think it's a good place to end here. We're going to continue the conversation in October at the conference. Thank you so much for, taking time out of your day to join me on the Stoic Salon Podcast, and I look forward to chatting again. Might end that now. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathryn.
Hey, great. Wonderful conversation.